Hello, friends. I'm Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and we are continuing today our series on how to have the best mental health possible during a crisis situation. I think at this point we're on part 4, probably. So, one of the things as I'm working with people and kind of like seeing what people are struggling with, I'm noticing that a lot of people have expectations for how they should be able to handle whatever they might be experiencing during this pandemic. So, a lot of people are having to be in quarantine of different types. They're either having to work at home or they're unemployed and at home. They have to work by themselves in their office. And, the circumstances are just vastly different than they were. So, as I'm listening to people talk, one of the things I'm noticing is there's an expectation that a lot of people are carrying that they should be able to be as productive as they were before the pandemic. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that expectation because, if we skip all the way to the good part, that's not really possible. But there are a few ways that a person can kind of maximize how they can function, whether you've got to get your work done, school work, you got to take care of your kids, whatever you've got to do. I mean, we all have tasks we need to do, and we want to do the best with them that we can. But a lot of people are beating themselves up because they are not doing as well with those as they were back before all this stuff started. So I want to talk about a couple of psychological principles about how people function in these kinds of situations and how you can use those to at least achieve the best results possible. But I mean, just starting from the beginning, you are not likely to be able to do as well as you were before all this pandemic stuff started and all of our circumstances drastically changed. So let's just start there. But psychological principle number 1. It is hard to have your brain function exactly the same as it would have before when survival is under some level of threat. So we've got that coming from a couple of places for really all of us. So number 1, obviously there is a reasonable chance that any individual can get sick or die from the COVID-19 virus. And I mean, it's while the death rate is, I guess low percentage wise, if you want to look at it that way, I mean, it's still like one of the biggest threats that a human being can face, in today's day and age. So it's the biggest survival threat many of us have ever experienced. If we had grown up in much different circumstances, it wouldn't be. But, in a world that has solved almost all of the usual survival threats, this one's actually really big. And what happens in your brain when you have a survival threat is that your higher orders of functioning are then less accessible the more you're under survival threat. Now, for a lot of us who are quarantining, our survival threat is still somewhat low, but it does take up a bit of our brain space because if we go to the grocery store or if we go to, fill up our car with gas or anything that gives us a slight exposure to other human beings, actually now carries with it more survival risk than it previously did. What that means is that survival is now taking up more, basically, of your processing space within your brain than it was 2-3 months ago. So just off of that, you functionally have fewer brain resources to devote to anything else that is not survival. Because even if you were doing basically nothing to help yourself to reduce your likelihood of getting any sort of infection, the fact that you know that infection and possible serious consequences are possible basically means that it's not optional. Your brain is oriented towards survival, so it will be thinking about this in the background whether you want it to or not. So that's psychological principle number 1. Your brain is going to automatically have some resources devoted to survival more than usual, so you have less to devote to everything else. Principle number 2, for almost all of us, I can't imagine anyone who doesn't have this at this time. All of our normal habits have kind of been turned upside down. And the reason this actually produces an awful lot of difficulty for people in having any sort of productivity, in getting their usual tasks done as efficiently as they used to, is a thing we don't think about very much. That every single habit we have is not one habit. Every habit is made up of a set of discrete, smaller habits. So I've produced content on this before, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much. But in short, the idea of exercising. So if somebody is going to exercise, they have to devote, number one, the time for it, which means they have to take that time from somewhere else. So there's two already. So carve time out here, add time here. Two small habits. Then they have to probably gain some sort of knowledge of what they should be doing. Either they have to go find it themselves, or they have to hire a person who is going to inform them what to do. So there's number three. And then if we sat with this for another 2 minutes, we would find probably 6, 7, 8, 10 smaller habits within that one greater habit of exercise. So what most people don't realize is now that we have multiple of our habits have been taken away from us or been forced to change, now we're having to reconstruct those, which means we are functionally reconstructing a dozen, 2 dozen, 50, maybe 100 smaller habits. Now, each of those doesn't take up much brain space, but when you put them all together and trying to reform habit after habit after habit, that takes an incredible amount of brain space, an incredible amount of our ability to track and to process. Human beings have a wonderful capacity within their brains to do a lot of stuff, but it's still finite. Our ability to track and process is finite, and anyone who's ever opened too many tabs or windows on a computer knows, okay, yeah, even if you've got a great machine, you might be able to have 50 windows open at once, but man, you started opening 53 and 55, it starts to slow down an awful lot. And most of our brains ain't that good at tracking multiple things all at once. So we're trying to track an incredible number of things right now just to reform the habits that we already had. Just take the parent who is now having to have their children at home, get them through their schooling while also maybe getting their work done working from home. That has to be 50 or 100 small discrete habits that they have to reform from scratch. There is no way to then maintain the same level of performance in, say, work as you would have previously, because you don't have as many resources to devote to it. So there's psychological principle number 2. The habit stack is going to really create a problem in the short term until we get our habits figured out again. But remember, we formed our habits over the space of 5, 10, maybe 15 years. Getting them all reformed within 3 months would be an amazing feat. You might take 6 months, 9 months. Hopefully we won't be under quarantine by next year, but we might be. This might take a long time, so you might not experience like getting all of your habits back in order for kind of a while. And that's actually what we would expect. That's not anything that you should beat yourself up about, because it's hard for us to reform years upon years worth of habits in the space of months. And then the third psychological principle, the last one for today, is we all experience a certain amount of variability in our emotions. They kind of go in waves. Some people have somewhat flat waves. Some people have more pronounced waves. But the thing that is sure for everyone is between what's happening with the first two, our habits all being upset and now there being survival problems, everybody's waves are going to get larger. If you were prone to, your dip, your bottom part of your wave was laziness, you're going to be prone to more pronounced laziness when you hit the bottom of the wave. If your bottom of the wave was anxiety, or if it was depression, no matter what it is, you can expect it to be more pronounced. The highs won't get really that much higher, but the lows will get lower. So the dips and the waves will be in their way worse. It's really important to understand that, because when our circumstances change for the worse, especially with survival and with habits, knowing that your dips are going to be worse is actually something that can be helpful, because then you're at least ready for it. It doesn't necessarily make it feel better, but in terms of you being able to function as well, when you're ready and prepared for it, it's easier to navigate those. So circling back to what I promised right at the beginning of the videos, I said, okay, we're going to use these principles to help you figure out how to navigate this a little more fully and at least have as much productivity as possible during this time. So the first part, the survival part, hopefully you're already doing all the action steps there, but the only thing you can really do there is take as many useful survival measures as possible. All the stuff people are recommending. Work from home if you can. Wear your protective gear. Wash your hands a bunch. Don't touch your face if you're out. All of the stuff that's in the public service announcements. Those are really the only things that you can do to enhance your ability to survive. You can do a few other small things like get creative, like if you happen to know that there's one grocery store that always has less people, go to that grocery store, because then you have functionally less exposure. But taking the best steps you can to reduce all of your exposures is at least some way to free up a little bit of the processing space, because you have slightly less survival threat. But that's hopefully everybody's already doing a lot of that stuff anyway, but if you're not, that is a great place to start. Now, the other two principles are a little easier to work with. So the habit stacks. One of the things that is deeply important is having the right expectation. A lot of people think they should be able to just conjure new good habits out of thin air, new productivity habits, new whatever. And that's not the case. All of our habits are the result of a great deal of experimentation on our part. Sometimes we get lucky and hit it on the first try, but most of the time we just keep trying stuff until things work. So I think the thing for people to do here is set the correct expectation that you're not going to reform all of your productivity habits instantly. And along with that, there's a lot of people who believe that now they have spare time on their hands. Like, for example, if you're not commuting to work, you have an extra 20, 30, 50 minutes in your day. That doesn't necessarily equate to more productivity. So make sure that that's, in this case, if this was back pre-pandemic and you just had an extra 50 minutes that you didn't know what to do with, you could use that time to achieve more. In this space, that's not going to happen because you already have too much processing power taken up. So at best, you're going to come out breaking even, but most likely you're still going to be slightly less productive than before. But taking time to reform your habits in the most sane way possible and taking the time to experiment is going to be important. So make sure you allow yourself the space to do that. It's not going to be perfect, and it's going to be messy while you figure it out. Let it be messy. And then the third one, the principle of the dips being deeper. This is the one that's easiest to work with. And here's how you plan for the dips. You know they'll happen. Everyone has them. So if you know that your dip is that you're going to be more lazy, plan for that as far as your tasks. And here's how you do that. If you're like a brain worker, in the sense that maybe you're a graphic designer and your work requires a lot of productivity and requires you to think a lot. A lot of creativity is the word I meant to say. A lot of creativity and it requires you to think a lot. Then you can't do your work very effectively during the dip. So when that happens, when you feel it come on, don't try and do your brain work during that time. That's when you can do the brainless stuff that nobody likes to do but still needs done. That's when you can do your DMV renewal, and that's when you can go, drop the car off and get it fixed. That's when you can clean out that one closet that needs cleaned out, or do the dishes. Like all of the brainless stuff that we all end up having to do at some point. Do those during the dip. Don't sit at your computer beating your head off of a keyboard trying to make your brain do a thing it can't do right there. And the nice thing about the waves is eventually you come back out of it. So just do the mindless stuff until you can come back out of it. And as soon as you feel yourself getting there, get back to your creative stuff or your brain task, whatever thing that is the more important, if we can break work into important and not important, I guess, but whatever thing that requires more brain resources. That's probably a better way to phrase that. So to sum up, you are not going to be able to be as productive as you were before all of this stuff broke out. There might be a few outliers out there for whom that's not true, but for 99.9% of us, we ain't going to be as productive. So don't set that as the goal. Setting the goal of coming as close as you can, that's pretty okay. But your survival needs will always take up a little brain space. Your habits need reformed. Your mood waves will be a little deeper than they were. So plan for those things. Meet your survival need as best as humanly possible. Reform your habits as best you can, but recognize that it's going to take time. Experiment around, see what works. And plan for the dips. It's okay to have those. We all have them. And your dips are just going to be a little deeper now. So figure out what can you do during those times while you wait for it to shift back into that, into that upward motion. We always have stuff we can do during those times. So please set reasonable expectations for yourselves. Please do not beat yourself up because you are not writing the next great novel, or you're not starting your successful side hustle right now. Some people are doing that, and if you can, great. That's not what's going to be the norm. And so make sure you're setting a reasonable expectation for yourself. Hopefully all of those ideas are helpful for you today. We will continue putting out content to have the best mental health you possibly can during this crazy crisis that we're all in. Thank you for hanging out with me for a few minutes today. My name is Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and I will see you next time.